All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to those of you that have already jumped in. I'll kind of slow roll the opening today, as I know most everyone tends to be back to back on conference calls these days. But my name is Dan Drood. I'm actually going to be running solo today, as Jason Webster is out. So just bear with me, as I'm his intellectual stunt double. I can get most of the job done, but he is certainly the technical guru that I know a lot of you have enjoyed working with. So. Looking forward to taking you through the Azure Solution Assessments program. As a quick reminder, before we get into things today, we do have a few people from the eGroup team on the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in there. As a reminder, we are recording the session. So while what you put in the chat will not show up in the recording, you are also, you might be able to, I'm actually not sure, be able to unmute and throw questions out there. So just be mindful of that. But really, again, if there's any commentary, any questions, anything like that, feel free to throw them in there. And if we can't answer them today, we will certainly follow up with you after the fact and to make sure we kind of dig into what's relevant to you. So just kind of set the stage here for our goal and what we want to set out to learn about. I'll go through a quick introduction on eGroup and who we are, what we do, for those of you that might not be familiar with us yet. We have 3 Microsoft Solution Assessments. It will actually be 4 the next time we go around this. We were actually just added to a new program, so I'll throw a little bit about that here in the end. That will take a fair amount of time just to kind of go through what they're for, what they do. And then I'll spend actually the bulk of our time on really what the deliverables look like. So we go through these assessments, not for the sake of assessing, but to help you map out business objectives to technology. And so we'll review kind of the presentation and content that you get as a participant in some of these programs here. And then lastly, we'll just wrap with a quick overview on kind of how to get started with some of this. For those of you that have been in these programs, that shouldn't be anything new to you. But if you're really looking to learn about how to leverage Microsoft Solution Assessments, my goal today is to help you really understand how to do that. So let's go ahead and kind of dig into introductions. Like I mentioned, again, my name is Dan Drood. I'm an account executive here. I'm based in the DC area in Northern Virginia. So I've been with eGroup for about 2 years. eGroup as a company has been around for a little over 2 decades now. And obviously today's a Microsoft focused event. We are a national solutions partner with Microsoft. We are a gold level partner and hold many advanced specialization certs across Azure Virtual Desktop, Windows, SQL, and a numerous other group of programs here. The focus for today will be primarily Azure with the Azure Solution Assessments, but we have a deep bench, if you will, of experts in-house that support our customers on both sides of the Microsoft Cloud, Modern Workplace or Microsoft 365, as well as Azure. And our goal is really to be an extension of your organization from start to finish. We'll talk a little bit about getting cloud ready and even just thinking about cloud. We can support you at that early of a level, and taking it all the way through to supporting highly complex cloud deployments. So really everything from kind of the design and planning to making sure that the cloud environment is kept up tight and clean with your governance policies, all the way out to some of those more complicated projects around disaster recovery, data protection, taking end users out to virtual desktop setups. We really support it kind of A to Z, if you will, from a Microsoft perspective. Our value add, kind of beyond that, is the ability to tie in a lot of our ecosystem partners to build out full solutions. So not just exclusively focusing on Microsoft, but having that expertise to bring in strategic ecosystem partners. And this ranges from anything to your endpoints and your identity management to your actual data center. So those workloads that you've got on premises and being able to continue to support those, but map out that hybrid cloud strategy. We stretch that out to data protection and integrate with very, very strong backup and disaster recovery type partners like Rubrik, Cohesity, Zerto, and what's available through Microsoft. And also have expertise, like I mentioned, in kind of the virtual desktop space, the end user space, across really all of the options out there, right? So your Citrixes, your Horizon View from the VMware side. We've seen a lot with Azure Virtual Desktop as of late, and that's certainly been a big focus for a lot of organizations as they look to Microsoft to help with consolidation efforts. But really, the value in having the team that we have here is the ability to tie solutions like the solutions that you see on screen into what we do around Azure and in Modern Workplace, and really build out that end goal that you have to drive productivity, to increase security, and really look at ways of making IT easier so that you can focus on what's actually relevant to your business. So if you have questions related to some of this stuff, feel free to throw those in as well. Obviously, we'll be focusing on Microsoft, but we're happy to kind of connect the dots on different aspects of your IT there. So any questions on eGroup, feel free to throw them in the chat. Happy to answer those as well. So with that being said, wanted to kind of kick off with the solution assessment overview. So there are a number of programs available, and we do have regularly occurring webinars that cover M365. So you see a few of those assessments on the right-hand side there. There are other programs like Azure Everywhere and Azure AMP, which we'll actually touch a bit about today. But the Azure Solution Assessment, highlighted there in green, that is going to be the primary focus. And so these are all incentive programs that are available to a very, if you think in terms of Microsoft having 80,000 partners globally, these programs are really only out there for about 50 partners in the world to have access to. And so eGroup is one of those partners. The Solution Assessment Program is something where it not only represents the ability to accelerate what you're looking to do in the cloud and help you make those evaluations faster and more efficient, but it also represents the strategic partnership that we have in Microsoft, because we do align very closely with the team, and that allows us to really hone in on what you're looking for. Those answers around, does it make sense? Does it work? How do I do it? And driving that with a lot of great content for you to pass on to business stakeholders. So like I said, we'll be focusing on the Azure Solution Assessments today. There are 3 that we'll talk about in a fair amount of detail. And like I mentioned, you'll see on the bottom right there, the Azure Modernization and Management, or what we call AMP. We'll touch on that one just a bit as well. But as we navigate this, think of these assessments in terms of stepping stones, starting with Azure Express to Azure Foundation Assessment, and then the Azure Migration Engagement. And Azure Express at a high level is hey, maybe I want a new car. I'm not going to buy one, on my first trip to the dealer. At least that's what most people say, right? And you want to just go kick the tires. So the Azure Express assessment is really to get a good understanding of what does your environment look like? How could that possibly map out to the cloud? And let's collect enough information to kind of build that high level view of what a cloud engagement might look like. This is not digging into specific projects. It's not digging into final cost or migration cost. It's really to get our heads around what you're working with, what your goals are, and how do we begin that journey. And so typically we'll see these, anywhere from 6 months to 2 years out from an actual project. They can be used at any time really, but they're really meant to help get a big picture view of what cloud could do for you. An extension of that, and something that's typically done in tandem with the Azure Express, is what we call our Azure Foundation Assessment. And this is when we take a little bit more granular look at what we've collected in the Azure Express engagement and actually start building out kind of that foundational plan around your cloud journey. So what does the framework actually look like based on what we know about your network, your servers, your storage, your applications? How do we address your actual needs? So going more from the Azure Express, that's a high level, here's how it works and here's how it could be applied. So all right, let's actually start some planning and let's build the frame of that house to get a feel for what this could actually look like. And so this is, again, kind of that next step after Azure Express. We build that foundational plan. That's why they call it the Azure Foundation Assessment. And it is, again, not quite specific to a certain project, but this is really for organizations that are thinking about that big project that maybe is next year, that's maybe 6 months away, and they want to get a good sense of where they need to be organizationally in order to start getting into the weeds of planning. And to follow on that, of course, is the Azure Migration Engagement. So this is when we've identified a project and we need to actually map out the cost and the actual plan for that engagement. So Azure Migration Engagement, it's not required to go through Azure Express and Azure Foundation Assessment prior to that. Oftentimes, IT folk, you are smart people. You've been planning, your entire career. You already have workloads identified. You already have projects set for the cloud. You have done your research. You know that you want to get there. How do I map that out? And maybe how do I do that a bit more efficiently? So you can skip the Azure Express and Azure Foundation Assessment and go right to the Azure Migration Engagement. And this is where we actually get into a lot of the design and planning and presenting the actual cost, the different considerations around, do we do lift and shift? Do we right size? Do we look at reserved instances? we get into a lot of detail around what this looks like, what it costs you, and then actually end up developing a plan around how to do it. So those are the the three solution assessments, and we'll go through some deliverables here in just a bit. What I wanted to call out with Azure Modernization and Management is this is the program that is available once we go through these various engagements. AMP is what we use to help support the efforts, right? So Microsoft obviously wants to incentivize the use of the Azure cloud, and part of that is providing funding to help partners like eGroup drive the activities needed to get you there. And AMP really boils down to understanding the potential spend of your organization in Azure, and then using their AMP program to provide a certain portion of the funding to help accelerate that and actually subsidize the engagement. So kind of depending on the workload, depending on what we are planning to do, AMP could cover, in theory, all of the costs. It's more typically, and when I say all of the costs, I mean a lot of the migration activities, not your Azure costs, but it's really meant to help with that lift and help kind of take off the initial spend that would potentially get in the way of you getting to cloud successfully. So they really want to use this program to enable their strategic partners to make sure that you have a successful migration. You've probably, at some point in your career tried to do something on your own and been like, oh, I wish I had some help with that, right? eGroup, you have one migration to do typically, right? And we have done countless migrations. So AMP is really a program to make sure that you have access to the expertise that we can deliver and make sure that that is in fact a successful engagement there. So those at a high level are the different programs. I'll dig into kind of the details of the three assessments here before we jump into what you get out of these assessments. So as I mentioned, Azure Express is kind of block one in this journey here. It's meant to give you some estimates, so we will go through some sort of pricing conversations, but again, they're estimates. It's not as granular as it would be if we were to calculate workloads and really dig into, each individual virtual machine or the actual amount of storage that you have. It also takes a look at just the general setup. What practices and procedures do you have on premises that would translate well into cloud? What things do we need to look at and call out to rectify before moving to cloud, right? So really just getting a basic understanding of the cloud best practice and making sure that we can capture that and make sure your team is educated on that. It also allows us to really start the data collection process. So we get an inventory of everything that we want to capture in the assessment. And that way we can take a quick look at, these are all the potential candidates for moving to service, platform as a service. We can take a look at your licensing and understand if there's any sort of changes that need to be made there. But it really is a good starting point. If you haven't done any of this work, it allows us to work with Microsoft to take on that load of inventory, assessing, and providing that initial overview of what this could look like. So a lot of groups do this in-house. Maybe they spend more time than they wanted to. If you haven't really considered Azure quite yet and haven't started building out just the inventory and everything like that, I would highly recommend Azure Express as a starting point. And as I mentioned, these are done in tandem with Microsoft. Microsoft actually provides dedicated resources to help with the data collection, to help with the planning of the information gathering, and we deliver that with them so that you've got kind of a full team on both sides to help with that. From a timing perspective, this slide, you'll see it looks very familiar to some of the other slides we'll go through, but this is typically the amount of time that you want to plan for. As I mentioned, it's a lighter engagement, so we're looking at maybe a month fully in terms of how much time we need to spend on this. A good bit of that time, of course, is spent on that planning and data collection phase, and because that's ultimately the most important part. We want to really understand the ebbs and flows of your data center, if any. We want to understand the workloads. We want to potentially map out to other teams and be able to understand just at a high level what you're working with, right? And this allows us to really begin to provide you a recommendation as to next steps, as to what we think needs to be done in order to be cloud ready. So as I mentioned, Azure Express is kind of the pretty straightforward planning approach. If you haven't started this process, we would absolutely want to talk to you about that. Typically, these are followed by the Azure Foundations Assessment if we want to dig into this deeper. This is really more of a move to get into some of the more granular understandings of the environment. So digging into all the various workloads. We've done an entire inventory of your data center. Maybe we want to use this engagement to identify what we call here the low-hanging fruit, but Certain workloads just make sense to get out there. Certain workloads make sense to convert to service. We'll start to prioritize and kind of map out where these workloads go in the grand scheme of things, and also start to take the learnings we have from the initial engagement and build those recommendations around what you're doing from a security perspective, what you're doing from a compliance perspective, right sizing. We start to get into that and also get a bit more granular on the estimates that we do across what you would be spending in Azure compared to what you might be spending on-prem, remaining as is, and also break it down beyond just what you would spend in Azure to look at if we do lift and shift, if we do right size, right, we want to make sure that we're starting to map that out in this engagement. Again, this engagement is also supported by Microsoft, so we've got a number of team members from the Microsoft group that we work with that really spend most of their time helping customers have a successful assessment experience. And they also help with a lot of the lift and planning that we do with them so that we can get you these answers faster. As I mentioned, this slide is very familiar at a high level with what I just showed you on the Azure Express, but what I do want to call out is because we are getting more into your policies, what you have set up from like a security perspective, a costing perspective, the different workloads, we're going to spend more time on that back end with data analysis and also our recommendations. So we have more time here because we do want to really get into the workloads at a higher level. We do want to take a look at, does this workload make sense to just move over as is? Should we right size it? What licensing considerations are there? That's something that we spend a lot more time on with the Azure Foundation Assessment, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we are building out that initial framework. So we've gone from high level concepts and what you should be considering as you think about this to actually starting to put together kind of that shell of a plan to get ready for identifying any workloads and services for migration. The final the final recommendations portion is longer as well, because this becomes less of a eGroup says to do this. We obviously have that expertise and will certainly drive you towards best practice, but it becomes more of a conversation at this point where we might put together kind of that first draft. And here's what we see based on what we talk about. But hey, I know my dev team, they're not going to want to touch Azure SQL, so let's yank that out of this plan, right? I think we've all been in groups that have some of those dynamics, right? And we want to make sure that we capture that, right? Not just the technical outcomes, but the business outcomes and kind of the business realities that you deal with to make sure that as we build this plan, it's reflective of your actual organization. So that's why you see more time on data analysis and also final recommendation, because it definitely becomes more specific to your organization and how we can address your specific needs. The last one here, which I would imagine a lot of groups, cloud's been around for a while. A lot of groups they've got it in their sites. So again, you can kind of jump right to Azure Migration Engagement. Hey, we've moved some stuff up to Azure on our own. It was pretty straightforward, but we've got some of these workloads where we're just not sure, how to do it, or if there's maybe a better way to do it. Maybe you have multiple locations across the country, globally, all right? And we've got a workload where, most of our business is based in the States, but we've got some groups that are over in the UK. We want to better understand how to migrate the workloads in the UK because we want those workloads to stay there. So this is where the Azure Migration Engagement really benefits our customers in that it allows us to hone in on specific workloads. We've got that project identified, and we need to know what it's going to cost and how we're going to get there. So this is where we spend a lot of time with our customers once we've gone through the initial assessments or once they've kind of done their initial discovery on their own and they're ready to rock. We're going to get into really the nuts and bolts of your architecture and map all of that out. We're going to get you those cost consumption estimates. Those get a lot more fine-tuned with this engagement because we're identifying specific workloads and having conversations around, what right sizing do we do? Do we convert this to a service? We've got X amount of SQL databases on premises. Let's go ahead and move that over to Azure SQL. Where are the licensing benefits in doing something like that? And then, of course, the actual migration plan. And I'll go into detail on this with some of the deliverables that we have, but actually the steps needed to successfully migrate, that is the primary outcome with the Azure Migration Engagement. So the previous two assessments are more around the ideas and the design, whereas this, as the name implies, right, we're going to actually be talking about that migration. And ultimately, what you're committing to when doing one of these is making that move, right? So the Azure Migration Engagement is we're serious about this. We understand the costs. We understand the commitments. Now we want to get that final solution and go ahead and start doing the work. And this is where we kick off a lot of awesome projects that transform businesses. And we'll talk a little bit about the deliverables here in just a moment. Again, this slide, we spent a lot more time on the data analysis and final recommendations. So the assumption here is that we have had a lot of conversations around your data. We've done a lot of discovery. We have workloads identified, prioritized, and selected for migration. And so it's really, again, more time on the back end, analyzing those workloads, understanding what you need from them once they're there, mapping out the governance policies that you want to have set in place, and then having that mutual discussion around, is this realistic? Can we get it done? Does it fit into what we're looking to do? And putting that together for you. So again, another great engagement. Don't have to go through the first two to get here. Can start right here. But that is the kind of the third assessment that we'll talk about today. So with that being said, I'm going to take a quick pause and just make sure I'm not seeing anything in the chat. If you have any questions or want to check out anything that we're doing, it looks like we're good on the chat here. Throw them in. Azure Express, Foundation Assessment, Migration Engagement. We can answer anything specifically or more broader terms, but I'll go ahead and now move into kind of the sample deliverables here. So what we'll be using is what we provide our customers on the end of a Azure Migration engagement. And so out of the gate immediately, right, the executive summary. We want to make sure that we're identifying all of the outcomes at a business level that we're looking to seek out and accomplish here. So not just, right, move to cloud, lower cost. Most people have those at a very high level, but are we looking at certain departments and increasing availability of files? Are we looking at the infrastructure locations that we have across the country and wanting to eliminate multiple DR sites or multiple locations that for whatever reason we just want to be out of the data center business, we want to reduce our footprint, we want to just have more geo redundancy that's more affordable in the cloud. What we want to accomplish, we absolutely want to make sure we capture here and call out in kind of this executive summary. And really, it's all the work that we've done in the assessments. This is pretty easy to put together. But again, I think it's very important because we can do a lot of work and a lot of technical work around designing cloud migrations. But at the end of the day, not everybody that is approving and working with you on this is necessarily mindful or driving their decision based on those technical requirements. We can have sound technical arguments for moving to the cloud, but we want to make sure that we're also capturing the impacts of the business. And so this is why we spend the time on really the assessment, the design, the planning, and understanding the business as part of these engagements. An extension of this, of course, is more of the technical stuff. So we call out kind of the quantities of what we're doing in the executive summary. But this is where we capture, right, the Azure Migration Engagement. It's about specific workloads. It's about prioritized needs. We're going to have all this mapped out for you, as well as next steps. And so you see down there a sample of a lot of the next steps, but the bulk of that and what we spend most of our time doing are the actual migrations. So we built all of this out. You have the estimated cost, and now it's time to actually present that plan forward. This executive summary slide here is where we capture a lot of that. This is a huge piece. It's always been a huge piece, but I think we see it more and more. Governance is where we actually want to highlight what we're doing in terms of addressing any sort of compliance requirements around SOX or HIPAA, GDPR. We want to make sure that the policies and groupings that you have in place are aligned with not just your business requirements, but industry requirements. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that, as we map all of this out, you have all those resources in place and all that understanding in place to be able to confidently move into the cloud securely. And so this is where we do spend a lot of time in that kind of design and final recommendation phase, really understanding and providing recommendations around what needs to be done from a governance perspective. And governance, it encompasses a lot of the things these days, but you'll see here on the screen using kind of Microsoft lingo, right? We want to make sure those policies are in place. You want to have your management group set up. If there's any automation we can do around adding policies and building templates to make this even easier, this is where we're going to call that out. And then also just being able to, again, what's the cost of compliance? Because certain requirements can require certain levels of availability, certain regions, all of that. We're going to make sure that we call that out so that from a security and policy perspective, there's a lot of that readily available to people that are involved in this. Another piece, of course, is network architecture. So in the initial assessments, we talked about really being able to kind of get that framework built in the migration engagement, we are going to come up with detailed plans and designs around what that network looks like in the cloud. Do we have to factor in any sort of hybrid connections and understanding that there's on-premises workloads remaining that we need to make sure map properly into your Azure environment? What can we do in terms of getting away from servers and going serverless? And how does that look from a network design perspective? So we'll spend a lot of time obviously discussing and capturing this information, but then mapping out and displaying where we are taking you in this migration engagement and what that end state will look like. And this can vary, customer to customer, of course. How do we want to design it? We've kind of established that foundation with the earlier assessments, and we map all of this out so that you can have that kind of referenceable, but also this is because we've spent a lot of time planning this. And so when we migrate there, you have a better understanding of what is working, what's going where, and how do we move forward with that, and how do we support that after the fact. This calls out specifically platform as a service. And so, like I mentioned on kind of that last side there, right, we're talking about infrastructure as a service, excuse me, and we also want to talk about platform as a service. So in that design, right, there are considerations for both. It's not just a lift and shift. We are not just moving virtual machines into the cloud. We are going to be looking for opportunities to leverage infrastructure as a service, as well as platform as a service, and making sure that, again, governance policies, everything you need from a security perspective, from a network perspective, connectivity perspective, all of that is accounted for. And so we do spend the time going into each example and each conversion that we might do. Of course, there will be things that are probably suited for lift and shift and can reside in cloud just as easily as they could on-prem. We have that conversation, but because we are getting into that cloud architecture, we want to make sure that we call out and spend a lot of time helping your team understand the benefits and the values and the why, more importantly, that we're going to infrastructure and platform as a service with various workloads. So again, calling that out specifically on its own, because the move to cloud isn't just to kind of get out of the data center business, as much as we all tend to want to do that. It's really to try and transform the way that you manage your business in getting to a new architecture and leveraging fully the benefits available to you there. Beyond that, right, getting to the cloud, you're not just counting on the fact that they've got more hardware than you. It would be nice, but we really want to make sure we spend a lot of time on business continuity. So I've got 2 slides starting with this one, disaster recovery first and foremost. What are we doing if East region goes out? We've been around enough to see, hey, AWS is down, Azure's had a blip, that kind of stuff. What are we doing to plan for that? Does it need to be across multiple sites? Does it need to go back to an on-site? Does it need to go just have multiple copies? What does disaster recovery mean for the workloads that we're moving to Azure? And so we can help you investigate technologies like Azure Site Recovery. Like I mentioned on kind of the introduction slides, though, technologies like Zerto, Rubrik, Cohesity, we can tie in other solutions that maybe address various needs, maybe in terms of just technology preference, in terms of SLAs, but we do spend a lot of time helping our customers understand what DR will look like for the workloads that we are moving out for infrastructure as a service resources. So it's very important to do something like this and to make sure that you're spending appropriate time on disaster recovery and data protection. Because yes, while you are in the cloud and there's self-healing infrastructure and they can suffer a lot of outages and you won't notice, you still want to have a plan in place, because you need to have a plan in place, right? I think we've seen enough that counting on just one regional data center, as secure and big as it may be, that's not enough these days. So this is a big piece of the conversation, and really, whether it's addressing cyber insurance requirements for what's your DR plan, or just making sure that you've got that peace of mind when you clock out for the day, this is a big piece and a big focus, of course, as part of the Azure Migration Engagement. On that, DR is only as good as your backup is only as good as your DR. So we talk about data protection. Azure Backup is the tool that we can leverage for that. Sometimes this conversation branches out to maybe you've already made an investment in a solution like Rubrik. How does that map out as part of this engagement, right? So we bring kind of our broad portfolio expertise to the table and help take a look at the native Microsoft solutions, but we can also incorporate our portfolio technologies and really build a plan around that. Do you want to take the Veeam that you've had for 5 years and move that with you to this new environment? Those are considerations that we'll need to make. And again, if you kind of get into the weeds on your Microsoft, your contract, right? They have redundancy built into their data center, but in terms of protecting your data and backing up your infrastructure, your M365, everything that you've got out there, that is absolutely on you. And we want to make sure that we capture that and don't have this part of your migration exposed. So this is a big piece that we dig into. You have native capabilities with Azure Backup for Azure Virtual Machines, but where we like to focus on eGroup is kind of that bigger picture and how we can help map all of that into this engagement. So again, business continuity, very important, and that's a part of the deliverable as well. What we also, of course, want to do is dig into the cost, right? And as you'll see here, a lot of organizations, you'll hear about, hey, we moved to the cloud and it cost me way more than my data center. It's probably because they did not go through an eGroup solution assessment. Just to be blunt, right? As you can see, as sized is it can be expensive if we're looking at 100 VMs or so, using the example here on the slide. You can move over and get to the cloud just fine, and you've got quite the bill in front of you. There is absolutely, in 99% of the time, going to be some sort of right sizing that we can do through the assessment, and this is where we start to call out those cost savings. Are there workloads where we can be pretty confident in how stable they are? All right, well, let's talk about reserved instances, what you'll see down here, the 3-year RI. So kind of committing to certain amounts of compute and storage, knowing that there won't be those fluctuations. You can even see more advantageous savings with things like reserved instances, as well as hybrid benefits, right? So being able to explore, and we touch on these in kind of the earlier assessments, the Azure Express, the Foundation Assessment. We talk about what reserved instances are, what hybrid benefits are, and the Azure Migration Engagement is the actual practical use of those to map out your actual costs. So that's why it's really important to do this planning, because as you see with this example slide, that the lift and shift model, while it works, it's probably not going to be like the best choice financially. And so we want to map all of that out for you. This slide really resonates with stakeholders of the business that may not care as much about what amount of power the databases are getting. They want to know how much it costs, and we can help you have those comparisons here to make those decisions when we do the migration here. Like I mentioned earlier, right, the data protection side. So we'll actually dig into kind of the costs. There's always kind of the, hey, I can get to the cloud fairly easily, but it's going to cost a lot to get out. We want to capture what some of those costs look like. So whether it's recoveries within Azure, recoveries across a hybrid environment, those are things that we need to explore. And so we do that as part of the Azure Migration Engagement. We map all of that out, and then we build out those forecasts for you. So it's really about having the what ifs accounted for and having some sort of plan in place for what that might cost, what that looks like, and making decisions based off of that. Do we need to have a full failover? Do we need to have these environments like for like at multiple sites? That depends a lot on kind of what it costs, right? Like how valuable is the application or the service to the business, and what do we need to do if we don't have access to that? So we account for that in terms of what the costs look like, so that we can consider that as part of the migration planning. Same thing on the backup side. How are we leveraging the various technologies to backups at various points in time, right? Your RPOs. What are we doing if we're doing it every 4 weeks versus every 12 weeks, whatever your SLAs may be? We'll spend time mapping out those costs, and of course, what the Azure backup services would look like on a monthly level. So again, a lot of details out of that Azure migration engagement, and we want to make sure we capture everything beyond that infrastructure, that the platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. We want to make sure that we're talking business continuity, because these things matter. They are surprises to groups that don't plan for this. And our goal as a strategic partner of Microsoft is to help you have a successful migration and not hit those surprises, right? Little less exciting than the last slides, but what we also provide as part of this assessment and what you would receive is really that 5-year Azure total cost of ownership. So mapping out, again, no surprises. We want to make sure that we've brought to your attention the production region. If we're in a much different region than for the DR site, we're going to map those out. We're going to provide you 5-year cost estimates. We tend to go high with these. eGroup provides Azure CSP. In a lot of cases, some of you have enterprise agreements, but like our Azure CSP, right, we can recognize some discounts and providing Azure resources to you. Also third-party costs. So again, going back to kind of our broader portfolio and tying that all together, being able to map out, if you have firewalls, if you've got other backup solutions, we can incorporate that into this migration assessment. So that's not necessarily something that Microsoft would be able to deliver outright. That was one of the big reasons why we were selected into this program, is because there are a lot of ecosystem partners that we can incorporate into these conversations to give you that big picture and not just kind of that Microsoft path. So I reference Rubrik a lot as kind of a backup. Microsoft recently made an investment in them. They've got a great Office M365 solution. What does Rubrik look like as backing up your Azure VMs, for example? So making sure we call that out. Down here towards the bottom, obviously, if we're doing a migration, what are those costs? So what are we doing from the actual setup and getting you there, our migration services? And then what is eGroup doing with our managed Azure, with our managed M365? We support our customers at various levels, whether you just need us on call for X amount of time a month, to actually getting in there and taking ownership of various aspects of that environment. We want to map all that out as well, so that we can be as involved or not involved in the long-term duration of this engagement as you need us to be. And then, like I mentioned very early on, Microsoft AMP, what we're going to do at this tier, we're going to have all the ammo we need to go in and submit for funding to help cover the cost of this engagement. So there's obviously a qualification process that we need to go through. Microsoft has various tiers. It's not just, hey, everybody gets AMP. But it's pretty easy to kind of go through this process and qualify to which level that you get. And we want to incorporate that, right? We want to get Microsoft to help subsidize this engagement. It really, I think, when you're able to take this to business stakeholders and say, Microsoft supporting our work, we're able to reduce the upfront cost of getting there. I think that helps with this transformation activity in many ways, and really can, if you can allocate that money elsewhere in the budget, maybe more staff or more technologies that you want to leverage for business services and apps, it's really important to call out the Microsoft AMP there. So that's something that we include with this as well. All of this is, assessment stuff. So let's talk about next steps, right? The actual migration planning and what we plan to do. So these are typical steps. We're going to have this deliverable here. The actual migration plan will not be a PowerPoint. It's much more detailed. We spent a lot of time writing these statement of works out. But really, that is what we aim for after this migration engagement is, if everything looks good, we'll go ahead and kind of put together that formal migration plan. This will have a lot of those steps laid out at a high level. We will also at this stage call out what we need to do in order to submit for funding and work through that process as well. And at the end of this, you get this overview, kind of this assessment overview. We'll have all of the architecture and design documentation developed in this process as part of that. And then really anything else that needs to be done. Maybe you just need to get a handful of licenses. Maybe we need to move from an EA to a CSP. Any kind of specific next steps that we need to call out, we'll have in there. And then any other planning or plans that are part of this conversation, we'll have that as the deliverables as well. So, the big goal of all this is obviously to begin that and help you get there faster. So that, I believe, is pretty much it in terms of kind of the Azure Migration Assessment. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of wrap here if there are no questions, but really how to find out about this. I mean, we covered a lot. Feel free to, again, to throw questions into the chat. Reach out to eGroup. Jason's info is there if you want to shoot him a note and tell him how well I did as his stunt double today. That's certainly appreciated. Yeah, I mean, we do these a lot, and I kind of joke about the stunt double because he and we do a lot of these, but it's really straightforward to kind of have this conversation. We can talk about the different assessments in maybe 30 minutes and find where to start. For a lot of groups, Azure Express makes a lot of sense. You haven't done it, you don't have the bandwidth, and we can use that to kind of springboard you into the planning phase. But I would imagine a lot of groups out there, with the pandemic in particular, that cloud conversation has become top of mind, and we can jump right into what an Azure Migration Engagement looks like, what you qualify for out of that engagement. Reach out to Microsoft, do all that correspondence for you, and get things rolling. So yeah, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat. We'll hold the line open for a little bit here. And really, again, just wanted to say thanks for your time. I know plenty of webinars out there, so thanks for choosing ours. And we'll look to see you on some of the next sessions.